Hello, everyone. My name is Sasha. I'm here as a peer educator, part of the Center for Women and Gender Equity. I want to thank everybody for coming to our Equality series featuring various amount of speakers. And today we will be having our speaker, Jamilah Lemieux, in a discussion about the complicated relationship between Black Americans and suffrage and how protest movements and electoral politics intersect and what it means to give someone your vote. I want to thank the various organizations that are a part of this conversation series. So without further ado, Nani, you can take us to our conversation.
Hi everybody. My name is Nani, and I will be, before we get into the speaker part, we're going to do a little identity check and a short activity. So for this identity check, I'm going to ask all of you just to consider who you are. So if you identify as a woman, go ahead and mentally raise your hand for me. And if you are younger than 21, mentally raise your hand. If you are a person of color, mentally raise your hand. And if you don't own any property, mentally raise your hand. Okay, so I personally am not a white landowning male. So therefore, in the not too far off past, I wouldn't have been able to vote. And if you at any point during that activity had to mentally raise your hand, you wouldn't have been able to vote either. So with that being said, I'm gonna ask you to participate in this short activity just to consider how your identity may affect, how you vote. Also, just so you all know, this presentation is being recorded. Just to let you all know, I'm gonna put a link to a Jamboard in the chat. And the Jamboard has this question: what's something you want to see on the political agenda of your county, state, or country? So you can just go ahead and use the Post-it note feature and just put down something that you think is imperative, on whomever politician on their agenda. And we're just gonna, quickly go through before we get to the Jamilah part. Okay, so far I'm seeing a lot of very important things. As I see police abolition, prison abolition. I'm loving these words. Immigrant rights, racial justice, and I immediately think, what do these things possibly have to do with one's identity? I see transgender rights. I see environment, peace movement, access to health care, legalization of marijuana, but also expunging records of those with prior convictions, public health from HIV to COVID, housing for all, environmental justice. Okay. It's interesting just to consider, are the people who are on our ballots, are they pushing these things? It's interesting to consider. Me personally, I want to see racial justice on anyone's agenda. I want to see education reform on anyone's agenda. I definitely want to see the legalization of marijuana and the expungement of records of people who were, had marijuana-based convictions. Healthcare is really prevalent to me, especially as a 19-year-old. Yeah. I mean, if you also want to utilize the chat, you can do that as well. But all these are really, really important. And I wonder how these all intersect with your identities. But that was just a short activity to get you all thinking about how your identity may correspond with, what you want to see politicians do, what you want to see politics do generally. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Tyler, who's going to do us the honor of introducing our speaker, Jamilah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tyler Hamler. I'm a peer educator at the Center for Women and Gender Equity, and I will be introducing our wonderful speaker, Jamilah Lemieux. So Jamilah Lemieux is a renowned cultural critic and writer with a focus on issues of race, gender, and sexuality. Jamilah Lemieux is a millennial feminist thinker, social influencer, and game-changing media maverick. In 2018, she launched the Lemieux Group, a consulting firm that provides communications, public relations, and crisis management services. In this capacity, she serves as the communications and engagement strategist to Cynthia Nixon's campaign for governor of New York, and as a communication strategist for the Girls for Gender Equity, a leading grassroots organizing, advocacy, policy, and service delivery organization centering youth of color within the racial and gender justice movement of the 21st century. As a public speaker, Lemieux has addressed countless audiences at schools, conferences, and cultural events, including the official commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the death of Malcolm X. Her previous public speaking appearances include panels, keynotes, and hosting duties at Columbia University, Vassar College, Howard University, Georgetown, NYU, the Brooklyn Museum, Penn State, Morehouse College, Emory University, Howard University, and many more. Jamilah Lemieux has been featured on the Route 100 list of the nation's most influential African Americans, and she has been honored by Planned Parenthood, the New York City Council, the New York State Senate, Black Women's Blueprint, Walker's Legacy, and the Delta Rho Omega Rho chapter of the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. She divides her time between Brooklyn and Los Angeles. So a few technical things before we get started. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function, or you can put them in the chat box. Q&A function allows for you to submit questions anonymously. So without further ado, please welcome me, or please help me in welcoming Jamilah Lemieux.
Thank you all so much. I'm very excited to be back on campus with you all, and grateful to those of you all who made time this evening. I know it's 6 o'clock and a lot of you all are done with school for the day and looking forward to getting some rest or some time on Zoom with your friends or doing anything but sitting in a lecture. So I will try to make this as painless as possible, and hopefully we'll have a really great dialogue. I am always very excited to talk to younger people. When I first started doing college speaking, and I think I mentioned this at Westchester, we were all millennials, and now you all are not millennials, and millennial sounds like a big word for old people, but I always feel inspired and lifted when I get to talk to college students, and particularly in this moment, especially considering that while, most of us are in our homes or isolated from people we would typically engage with in person, that I can connect with you all in this way, and also by watching you all on your TikToks and across other social media platforms. You all make me optimistic for the future. I don't know that I can do that for you in the way that you can do it for me. But I am so convinced that without putting the onus of leading our country out of the darkness in which it has always existed on its youngest adults, that you all are at the forefront of, I think, a really powerful transformative change and a reckoning with things that previous generations, not so much mine, we're still pretty young too, but the generations before us failed to address in a meaningful way. So I asked that it would be easier for me if you all comment in the chat versus the Jamboard, but I will go back and check the Jamboard and see if there's something else that goes up there that hasn't, but I will be peeking at the chat periodically while I switch between Zoom and my notes. So, okay, I'm sorry, I thought I heard my child in the background. So last week, a rapper who was very popular before most of you all were born made headlines when a Trump administration official tweeted something implying that he had gotten on board with the president's reelection efforts. Now, you all may know Ice Cube from his role as Craig in the movie Friday, or his role as Craig in the Barbershop films, and he played Craig in The Players Club and Craig in the Are We There Yet films, and a number of other movies in which he played essentially the same guy with the same Los Angeles accent. But of course, before he being Ice Cube, was known as a Hollywood power player. He was one of the leading members of NWA, short for Niggas with Attitude, the Compton rap collective that proudly embraced the notion that they were the world's most dangerous group from 1987 till about 1991. Uh, NWA's most famous song, which many of you all probably are familiar with, even though you didn't grow up with Ice Cube, the rapper, is Fuck the Police. The song is often cited as evidence of the group's impact and importance. But I think it's important to note that NWA didn't make Black Power protest music, nor did they provide any unique insight into the lives of young Black men born into urban ghettos across the nation and entangled in cycles of intra-community violence. Side note, while I'd never challenged the validity of the overarching message of Fuck the Police, which is that the system abuses Black men, and they are specifically talking about Black men, be clear, I do think it's worth noting that this is a song that was recorded in response to an event that took place after the members of the group NWA were shooting paintballs at civilians, right? As celebrities have a tendency to taunt and poke and play with poor people for some reason on a bus stop, which led to a unfortunate encounter with the police. This was not a rap group that was truly political in the way we speak about NWA would imply, that they were dropping knowledge, that they were teaching us things, that they were really even casting a light on the crisis of being a young Black man who lives in Compton and would be inclined to join a gang. Their music was deeply violent, and the majority of that violence was targeted toward other young Black men and toward Black women. And I'd argue that their greatest legacy, their enduring contribution to the landscape of hip hop and popular music as a whole, has been the way that they helped to normalize rampant misogyny in rap music. And as NWA's political legacy is overstated, the same goes for Ice Cube. I'm trying to give you some context on this person who popped up on many of you all's radars, perhaps for the very first time, and the very significant thing that I think he represents in this moment. When Ice Cube left the group for a solo career, he released an album called America's Most Wanted, spelled with 3 Ks, which certainly was defined by content that critiqued, again, police brutality and systemic racism and the behavior of non-Black business owners of color in Black communities. It also condemned Jewish record executives by pointing a finger at quote unquote Jews, as opposed to including them in the very large group of white business leaders across fields of industry that have disenfranchised and abused Black people, that it wasn't their Jewishness that had led them to lock a group like NWA into a bad contract. This is what capitalism does, and this is what white business leaders have done. There was a lot of controversy about him specifically calling out Jewish people. Much like Ice Cube's work with NWA, his solo work was filthy with misogyny. And I want to quote just one song for you. It's from a track called A Man's World, which was a battle of the sexes duet, if you will, with a young woman rapper by the name of Yo-Yo, who was Ice Cube's protege. He said, "What gives? I hear females always talking about women's lib. Well, get your own crib and stay there instead of having more babies for the welfare. Because if you don't, I'll label you a gold digger. The name is Ice Cube. You know I ain't the nigga for you to look at when your hair get nappy. So take a piece of the pole and be happy." So yes, Ice Cube was present and accounted for during the early debates about rap's explicit lyrics and censorship. And he raised his voice against the police in a vague, trite way that has been read as profound due to a number of factors, timing and his gender being chief among them. And as such, he long enjoyed a reputation for being a political dude, for being radical. But for the better part of 3 decades, his work has not been political nor radical. He did release a very pointed anti-Trump song in 2016, but aside from that, he has created a reputation for himself as an actor, a family movie guy, a filmmaker. Yet he felt empowered to sit at his computer in 2020, seemingly alone, and develop a plan for Black America. He didn't engage with organizations like the Movements for Black Lives or any other groups that have done this work for years. He did not consider or acknowledge in any meaningful way the unique needs of Black women and girls, of Black LGBTQ people, of Black disabled people, and of Black immigrants. And his lack of savvy in this arena left him open to be used by the Trump administration's lazy last-ditch attempt at turning things around with Black voters, or enough Black voters to get them over the finish line in a few key battleground states, after running 2 campaigns and the better part of a presidential term fueled by unabashed white nationalism. Now, while Cube didn't explicitly endorse Donald Trump, and he does seem to have issues with the way that the White House meetings between his team and the Trump administration were spun to imply otherwise, he called out Joe Biden for not meeting with him and acknowledged the ways that Trump's new platinum plan for Black America includes some of the demands that he attempted to make in the plan that he, Ice Cube, a person who speaks for question mark around that, made by himself. He acknowledged and affirmed that the Trump administration was willing to work with him and listen, and that he felt, unheard by Biden because he didn't meet with Biden himself, though he did meet with senior members of Biden's team, including 2 Black women. So in the same period of time that you have this debacle going on, which should feel like a distraction and silliness to even have to talk about during a global pandemic, during sustained racial uprising and a white nationalist movement that is swelling by the day, a white nationalist movement that has always existed in this country, but one that has become certainly less hidden than it was in years past. But there's something else afoot. We're talking about identity today, right? We're talking about how identity informs the ways that we vote, the ways that we don't vote, who we vote for, how we feel about voting, and what role it plays in the ballot box. So the same time Cube is doing his thing, you've got 50 Cent, not known for being a terribly political guy or a very nice one, who pops up and shares a grossly inaccurate Fox News graphic that suggests that a Biden presidency would increase the tax rate to 62%. And in this social post, he acknowledges that Trump doesn't fuck with the Blacks, but he encourages a vote for him nonetheless. A few days prior, Diddy announces a new political organization that he's launched called the Black Party that has, unlike Ice Cube's efforts, engaged experts and researchers and folks that have been doing work on the ground for a long time. But it has led people to raise the question, why not simply support one of the existing groups? Why look to create something new right now? And also, what sort of demands can a new group put forward of either political party at a point in which we are mere weeks away from the actual, the end of the election, I should say, not voting day, because people have been voting for months at this point. These men are among a growing number of Black male notables that have publicly asked why the Democratic Party is worthy of the Black vote. And that's a very reasonable question, considering that Black people have existed under poor conditions under every single presidential administration, including the one with a Black face, and that the DNC has failed to adequately center racial justice among its chief concerns. Most damningly, the 1994 crime bill that would deliver us into the era of mass incarceration as we now know it was authored by the very man who somehow sort of stumbled and landed on the top of the ticket. Context. We're operating on a timeline that began in 2014 when the 3 founding members of Black Lives Matter became among the most visible representation of an emergent Black civil rights movement. They were women, 2 of them were queer, and it was said openly and on large platforms for the first time ever that this and all fights for Black liberation that have taken place on this soil have relied heavily on the labor of Black women, of Black, queer, and trans people, and thus they must be centered in that fight. It was stated, it was screamed that we were no longer looking for a charismatic, cishet, charming, handsome Black male leader to deliver us, that that's not the only voice and perspective that matters in our community, and that we have also failed to adequately vet some of the people who live up to that ideal because they present in a package that looks to us like what leadership is supposed to be. because they've shown up in a box that we know how to respect. There was immediate pushback to that. There was the emergence of what could be described as a fringe political group that centers the idea that African Americans should divest from the rest of the diaspora, that as the African descendants of slaves, as they call themselves, we are beholden to one another first and foremost, that there are things that we are entitled to from this nation that other African peoples living here are not, that we have not been able to count on them for solidarity and support, and that we essentially are not connected to the continent. And I think that that is a particularly horrific proposition, and one that's made even more horrific as we look at the violence that's taking place in the streets of Nigeria right now. And we see the parallels between the ways in which even in a Black nation, a formerly colonized Black nation, Black people do not have the right to live and be free. And that we should see that as a global struggle as opposed to a local one. But there's a group of people saying, no, it's just us, right? It's just the African descendants of slaves. It's just people who can prove that they are direct descendants of people who were held in chattel slavery in the United States specifically. There has been pushback to the centering of Black women in this modern day social justice movement. There has been a response, I think, to decades of talk that Black men are quote unquote endangered species, and the widely accepted mythology that Black men and boys are faring worse in society than Black women and girls, and the widely accepted belief that all Black people have a responsibility and an investment in the betterment of our males, but that's not something that necessarily extends to women and girls. And when we add gender identity and expression into the fold, we come up with an even narrower group of Black people whose identities are worthy of being centered in any meaningful way, that are worthy of being treated with importance, and worthy or appropriate to be identified as Black, that this is Black stuff. Black women's issues is Black stuff, right? That Black women's needs and concerns should be centered to any Black agenda. So somebody who had an agenda for Black people that did not acknowledge the Black maternal health crisis is somebody who arguably should not deputize themselves as somebody that, or rather designate themselves as somebody who can speak on behalf of the Black masses, particularly in a moment in which finally, we as Black women are receiving a certain level of acknowledgement and celebration for our political contributions and activism work. 2 years later, after BLM explodes, Donald Trump clutches the presidency. White women were immediately identified as a great source of his success, of course, with 53% of white women voters casting a ballot for a man who had just days earlier been heard saying on tape that you can just grab them by the pussy. When you're rich, they let you do it. Meanwhile, 94% of Black women had showed up for Clinton, a woman who cuts a very complicated figure in our community for a number of reasons, giving birth to the echoes of listen to Black women. 94% of Black women did the right thing. If you vote like a Black woman, everybody will be okay. And finally, the DNC began recognizing what an important voting bloc Black women had been. And finally, their engagement began to change to reflect that, which likely leads to Biden's selection of Senator Kamala Harris, who also ran for the nomination as his running mate. So a handful of prominent Black men would shock fans in the early days of the Trump presidency, either by meeting with the president like Steve Harvey did, or asking that we give him a chance like Dave Chappelle did. Of course, there was nobody who took it as far as Kanye West, who would wear the MAGA hat and sit for pictures in the Oval Office, and at one point explicitly expressed his support for Trump. And now he's on the ballot in a few states as a VP candidate while asking people to write him in as president. Meanwhile, it's pretty clear that the light-skinned biracial woman senator on the ballot is not going to drum up the same excitement that the last light-skinned biracial candidate to run with Joe Biden was able to command. There are a number of very valid debates to be had over Senator Harris's prosecutorial record and her own run for the big seat. However, considering that Black voters overwhelmingly went for Biden across the country, who is himself the author of that crime bill, who sits to the political right of a Kamala Harris, it's not the cop mala, quote unquote, reputation alone that is responsible for the difference in enthusiasm that Black folks in general had for Obama versus the senator from California, who also has no cute little family of her own for us to embrace. She doesn't have her own children, and she's got a white husband, and 2 adult stepdaughters are certainly not going to make us want to buy t-shirts and family calendars and church fans in the way that those cute little pictures of Sasha and Malia did. There seems to be sentiment that the DNC's embrace of Black women for all of 4 years, let's say perhaps 2 in theory and 2 in practice, is somehow not connected to the needs and concerns of Black men. Despite the unmatched support that Black women offer to the men in our lives and our communities. The groups of blue-collar Black women who've organized their colleagues to go vote, the church ladies and the sorority sisters who have always organized and turned up the polls, have not been pushing some sort of feminist agenda that flips things on its head, that says we're the most maligned and the most neglected and the most in need. We should be the focus of the community. Well, that wouldn't be a truly feminist agenda, because we wouldn't be identifying ourselves as the most marginalized. Of course, we'd be saying that we need to address the needs and concerns of all our people, which is historically what Black feminism has done and advocated for. I wish that we were showing up with the feminist agenda while we've been doing this work, while we've been beating the drum for a party that has largely ignored our needs. But no, they have instead we have swallowed our distaste and our disappointment. And we have more often than not cast a ballot based on what seemed to be in the greatest interest of the community. And that's why, despite the number of Black women who could very easily be described as Christian conservatives, in many regards have not made a significant showing for GOP candidates on a local or national level in decades. While we reckon with the complicated, arguably loathsome political figure that is Joe Biden, and a set of circumstances that have made it seem like he may literally be the difference between life and death for people in this country, I also like to reckon with what it means to see a group of influential Black men use their platforms to direct votes away from what the lesser of 2 evils, using their platforms to direct votes away from what many would argue is, at the very least, the lesser of 2 evils. Not in the name of political revolution or rebirth, right? Not the guy who enjoyed the benefits of being seen as this militant, towering figure in hip hop, this outspoken voice like Ice Cube for some things that he said in the early 90s. It's not about revolution. It's not about being radical. It's not about destroying the system and building something new, but yet directing votes in a way that will guarantee keeping power in the hands of a man who has packed courts with judges across the country that will serve lifetime appointments, doing the work of white supremacy, continuing to uphold a system of inequity, continuing to incarcerate Black people, Black men certainly at a higher rate than Black women, and Black women at a higher rate than any other group of women in this country. It is putting that power, maintaining that power in the hands of somebody who publicly called for the murder of Black and brown men, the Central Park Five. As you recall, I'm sure most of you all saw in the Netflix film that Trump took out a full-page ad in the New York Times advocating for a return to the death penalty in New York State, so that the Central Park Five, who would eventually be exonerated, could be executed for something that they had not done. And he drummed up support for that. For somebody who coded applications for apartments in his properties so that Black applicants couldn't get through. Someone who has devastated the nation with his failed response to the coronavirus. The reason that we are sitting, I'm sure you love to see my little wallpaper, but I would much rather see your campus. I would much rather look you in the eye and walk around with you guys and be having this connection face to face. And the reason that we can't do that is because of the way that the leadership of this country from the very top responded to a global pandemic, the way that they ignored science, the way that they ignored experts and decided to keep things as open as possible for as long as possible. A man who basically killed Herman Cain, had him at a rally, preaching the coronavirus is a myth stuff. And within a matter of weeks, he was gone with little fanfare. And I certainly won't mention the rape and the allegations of rape and the sexism on the part of Donald Trump as a reason that men shouldn't support him, because they're so rarely a factor in how men, particularly cishet men, I should say, choose to engage with other men. We see his record. We know what he's about. So if we're talking about identity and we're talking about politics, or rather we're talking about identity and we're talking about voting, what part of our identity as Black people and what part of someone's identity as a Black man should direct them to a place in which it is ideal, or it is preferred, or it is even worth the risk of having someone like Donald Trump, who is so unapologetically anti-Black, to remain at the top of the food chain here, to remain in office, to remain in power, to remain able to do harm over our bodies, over our lives. Historically, the two parties and throughout our lifetimes have been thought of as the GOP is the party of the wealthy, and the Democrats is the party of the working class, or the middle class. There's no agreement in this country about what it means to be working class or to be middle class, but we've typically thought of it as the wealthy Republicans who are fighting to protect the rich from tax cuts, and the Democrats that are fighting for the little guy. Both of those are flattenings of the very complicated political identities of Democrats and Republicans. But there is certainly an allegiance that wealthier people have had to the Republican Party because of their willingness to protect wealth, to install systems and rules that protect the people who make the most from having to contribute to the upkeep of society in the way that the poorest among us have to, that have prevented protections for workers, have prevented those of us who were not born into means to have the access to the educations and the resources and the jobs that would allow us to enjoy a higher standard of living. There's something clear there, right? And so there's this been idea that charismatic Black men, that rappers, that entertainers, and that's another thing, on all sides of the aisle, while entertainers are certainly politically active and engaged, you don't see white celebrities called to speak on behalf of their communities in the way that Black celebrities are. That Ice Cube was treated as seriously as he was, that Kanye West was seen as an opportunity to deliver Black votes, as opposed to engaging with Black senators or Black organizers or Black activists that were going to rappers and entertainers, says a lot. That tells a very damning story. But when we're talking about identity, we have so tightly been wrapped into the idea that the success of our visible Black celebrity class is one, that it's collective success, two, that they have our best interests in mind, and three, that great means and great wealth might not change these people politically, right? Because if I'm Ice Cube or 50 Cent or Kanye West, I don't have the same concerns that a Black man my age who earns $37,000 a year has, in terms of job security, in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of being able to obtain housing. So the person who's not going to cut my taxes might make more sense for me. And if this person also is tapping into the neglect that I'm feeling because the DNC is talking to the girl, they're talking to the females, they're talking to the women, they're listening to Black women, who's listening to Black men? We have to reckon with the fact that many of us, and this is not exclusive to Black men, these are just hyper visible examples, have political identities that are so flimsy that they can easily be bought and sold and compromised when somebody is willing to give us a little something. And because of the complicated nature of our relationship to the, I stutter a little bit, to the Democratic Party, to the ways in which the Democratic Party has been able to count on our vote for decades without having to deliver to us the sort of fight that we deserve in the halls of Congress, the sort of legislation that we are long overdue, the sort of unabashed support for something as simple, as mind-blowingly simple as a phrase like Black Lives Matter, that it took us getting to this point where we had an unapologetic white supremacist president who's essentially stoking the flames for a race war in full sight, that it took that combined with graphic images of a Black man being murdered on camera once again, that it took a Black woman being asleep in her bed and being murdered. And of course, be clear, the rallying around Breonna Taylor's death is because she was asleep, because if she was awake, we would have found a way to make her an accomplice in her own demise in some way. There would have been a question about how she spoke to the officers who entered her home, what she may have had in her home, what she could have done differently to not have been killed by armed men who burst into her house late at night. But it took that level of public racism to even get to a place where politicians on the left who hadn't been raising this messaging before, corporations, individuals, and institutions are ready to say, okay, you know what, Black Lives Matter. They do matter. We are so sorry. And we stand with you. And we've always stood with you. And we certainly know that that's not true for all of these folks that have stood up and declared their support and compassion for us now. Because of course we remember how controversial the words Black Lives Matter were in 2014. That was not something that everyone felt comfortable saying. That was not something that a lot of Black folks felt comfortable saying, certainly not in public. I want to peek into the chat real quick, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm curious to know about the public lynching question or remark, but yes, economic position. It historically has been the belief that people vote with their economic identity, right? And so that people who vote for the Republican Party either are people of means or they are of the misconception that one day they will be people of means. So they are trying to protect the interests of the wealthy because at one point they too will be wealthy and they don't want to be impacted by these social programs and these tax cuts and things that rich people have deemed to be harmful, even though all of the data shows us that they're not, right? That these, that increasing taxes on wealthy people would not cease to, it wouldn't take away their wealth. They would still be wealthy people. It wouldn't be taking away the majority of their fortune. It wouldn't be asking them to pour the majority of what they've amassed into the nation. It would be somewhere along the lines of paying a penalty on the money that they make above a certain amount of money. So if you make $400,000 a year, I'm sorry, if you make $460,000 a year, you're taxed at a higher rate on the 60,000, not the 400,000, but the money you make over this threshold, right? And yet the idea that they're just going to come take up all your money has been so widely spread that somebody as old as 50 Cent would repeat a sentiment like they're going to tax you at a 62% rate. These gentlemen may be in a financial position in which their best interests are perhaps met by the Trump administration. If they ever needed to secure an abortion for someone, they could get that done from a private doctor. They're worried about losing some of their wealth, or paying more into the system that they're okay with you paying into as you buy their records and you support their music and their clothes and their other projects. But they're not saying, hey, I am a wealthy person and saying this is what makes sense. It's about the identity of Black men. They're saying, as Black men, I have questions. As a Black man, I'm standing up with a plan for our people. How have the limits to which we understand our own identity made us the ice cube in the room? When have we failed to consider that our agenda that centers Black women may neglect Black trans women? That when you're saying Black women, are you saying Black cis and trans women? Do you mean Black cis and trans women? Or are you only thinking of the issues that impact cishet women or cis women? Are you thinking about queer women? If you are someone who is not a member of the Black community, but is also engaged in racial justice work? Have you adequately thought about what your political beliefs and what you're willing to stand and fight for? Are they inclusive enough? Are they radical enough? Do they go far enough, right? That's central to this. But I want to go back to specifically to the DNC and to the Biden-Harris ticket, because I'm not trying to give them a pass or suggest that what we should do is what a lot of people did with President Obama, is get really excited by the idea of identity. There's a Black man, he's charismatic, he's got a cute family, we get to have a Black president, this is going to be so nice. And many of us, it's not that his words of hope and change were not inspirational and touching in many ways, but President Obama's always been a moderate. He sits to the right of present day Joe Biden. He sits to the right of Senator Harris, who is actually one of the most liberal senators in office right now in terms of her actual voting record, as opposed to how we think about her record as a prosecutor. But that there was still this celebration around the identity of our first Black president. He belongs to us. And who showed up and showed out to ensure that person was elected? Who was the critical voting bloc that delivered the win for him? It was Black women. And yes, there were Black male Republicans, Black men who voted Republican in the past, who shifted their vote over. But we don't have the same sense of obligation when we see a Black woman. Now, I'd love to believe that that's just an evolution of our understanding of politics, right? Because a lot of years have passed. We lived through the Obama administration. Those of us who were old enough to vote then or old enough to observe then can tell you that there were things that we would have perhaps wanted him to do or say differently, largely in terms of his role as a cultural influencer, that somebody who had basically a unfiltered microphone to the United States of America and to the world, and was one of the most popular, and still is one of the most popular and most well-liked politicians on the planet, that he did not use more of his cultural capital to advocate for, at the very least, a change in how people look at Black people, a change in how people think about us. Not simply by saying, well, look, they can't be so bad. This articulate man who's the president of the Harvard Law Review and his beautiful wife and their adorable children, look at them. The Black people can't be all bad. They're not all criminals. They're not all ghetto scum. No, it was the lack of saying, here's who my people are. Here's who we've always been. Here's how we've been dealt a very bad hand by this nation. And here's what it has done to us. Too often, it was public moralizing towards us. It's calling out Cousin Pookie and shaming us for certain things that we haven't done that other people don't do either. Shaming us for participating in protests that didn't fit the model of protest that only recently was deemed acceptable, because when the uprisings began in 2014, you would have thought the preference was that people didn't take to the streets at all. Now it's take to the streets, but just make sure you do it this way. Get your permit. But back then it was like uprising, protest. How could this be happening? Not now. We don't do this. We got to just vote. Just vote. If you want to make change, vote. There's certainly been a lot of don't complain, just vote. Don't yell, vote rhetoric this time around too. But I think there's also been a more widespread embrace of the idea that we can't just vote in the ballot box. We have to also vote with our feet, that people have to protest, that there has to be civil unrest, that there has to be disruption, and there has to be a willingness to make sacrifices for things to change. And with that, despite this complicated set of circumstances that led to the election of President Obama, that led to the election of President Trump, we've arrived with somebody like Joe Biden, who helped to write the crime bill, who helped to lead to a wave of 3 strike laws across the country, in which people who had committed 3 felony crimes, had been convicted, I should say, of 3 felonies, may have been susceptible to life sentences. That increased the number of death penalty cases and people who were put to death or scheduled to be put to death. That introduced hundreds of thousands of new police officers into communities of color across the country. This piece of legislation that did great harm. And yet, identity. Was it our identification? We had options. Kamala Harris was on the ballot, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. Is this all about celebrity worship? Is Biden on the top of the ballot because he is experienced and has served his country and was a vice president, knows what he's doing? Or did he make it there because he was the most famous person in the primaries? Because he was the most recognizable figure? There were some who said that the fact that he was willing to be number 2 to President Obama may have impacted Black voters, which I find mind-blowing. I cannot think of a lower standard to have for someone other than this person who had run for president unsuccessfully before, who did not have what Barack Obama did to become a national political figure, was willing to humble himself to get a seat that he that was one heartbeat away from a role that he desperately wanted for a long time. But there were people that believed that and that said that with their chest, that they were glad to see how Joe Biden was happy to be the second banana, to be Uncle Joe, while President Obama was the leader, that it takes a special kind of white man to take leadership from a Black man. What does that say about how we think about ourselves? I realize that I've gone a little bit over time. I'm going to wrap this up in a second. Then I want to invite questions. If you want to drop a question in the chat, or if you want to, I don't know if we're going to have folks raising their hand, but if you want to drop a question in the chat, please, I would absolutely love to answer it. But what does that say about our political identities? And what does that say about our personal identities? People vote with their identity. And that's something that studies only in recent years have begun to truly unpack, because we always saw it as being a matter of economics. Poor people are going to vote this way. People with means are going to vote this way. People who live in this part of the country are going to vote this way. But we're recognizing now that people will put aside the fact that a candidate speaks directly against their needs and concerns. Somebody who has done harm to their community. And I'm not just talking about Black men now, I'm talking about the rural whites that get all that fawning, fascinated coverage in the New York Times. Wow, what is the white working class going to do? Trump said he was going to bring back coal, but you can't bring back coal because it's the 2000s and there's no, we're not going to have a return to the coal industry because we've moved past it in so many ways. Those people voted against their actual interests. Those people who are reliant on food stamp programs, who needed access to health care that he has threatened to take away by attempting to destroy the Affordable Care Act. They're voting with their identities as white folks. They're voting to keep things the way they think they should be. And for many of them, restoring them to where they used to be. I haven't heard an answer, a concise, clear, or uniform answer to when America was great in regards to the Make America Great Again slogan, but it's clear that it refers to a time in which a Black person couldn't have been president or on a presidential ballot. When we think about what our identities are and which part of our identity we're thinking with first, I invite you all to reckon with, for those of you who are Black, what is your Black identity? Who are you beholden to? What does it mean to vote on behalf of the Black community? Does it mean you're thinking first about your taxes? Does it mean you're thinking first about healthcare and childcare? Does it mean you're looking at the color of the person who's on the ballot? I think it's interesting that Angela Davis, who is, of course, one of the most important figures on the left, who for years has been fighting against mass incarceration. She is arguably one of the most visible, best known experts on the issue or the matter of mass incarceration, and a longtime scholar and activist, and somebody who has been immortalized in pictures from her youth when she had a big afro and big sunglasses and very trendy clothing. and who has resented being trimmed down to disfigure this idea of who she was as a member of the Black Panther Party and the Communist Party, has come forward and acknowledged that, yes, there is something she finds exciting about seeing a Black woman on the ballot. That, yes, she also has concerns about Senator Harris's prosecutorial record and Joe Biden, but that she sees this as the group that can be pushed, that this is the battle we'd rather have. And that's why she was enthusiastically supporting enthusiastically encouraging people to vote for them, that it wasn't about celebrating the identities of the people who were on the ballot, but the end game, the end goal. So as we prepare to head into this election in a few weeks, and as I prepare to wrap up my remarks, I invite you all to think about, what's the biggest picture? What happens when it's your group, when you've been ignored by political parties for centuries, and one day somebody says, we want to talk to and about you all, and we've got some things we want to offer. If it feels if they sound good, if they look good, you're doing your research, right? You're not going to be nearly 50-year-old Ice Cube or 50-year-old Ice Cube not knowing the incredible work that the Trump administration has done to disenfranchise Black people, and acting as if the violence that he has prescribed for the bodies of Black people, Black men in particular, is irrelevant. You are going to be totally clear on what it means to hold space for other folks, right? And their needs and concerns, and to pay attention to that. And you're going to show up not necessarily just as a member of a particular political party or as somebody who wants to get the bad guy out of office, but as a whole entire person who is also able to recognize that you and your experiences do not exist in a vacuum, that Black men cannot be the spokespeople on behalf of all the Blacks, and that be that, nor can Black women, that young people cannot say we are the young voters and only be talking about young people between the ages of 18 and 25 in a particular part of the country, or college-trained people or activist-adjacent people. That we have to be more expansive in how we understand the world around us as it relates to our participation in this system. We have to think about the difference between simply choosing the lesser of two evils and having a strategy for either replacing this system with something that better serves our needs, replacing the current electives with people who better serve our needs, as opposed to simply saying, I'm tapping out. Last thought, I've heard a lot of people, young and old, say that they're not going to vote, or say they don't understand why they should vote, considering how many times they voted in the past or how many other people have voted in the past, even though you should all know that this is not a nation of voters, that the vast majority of Americans do not vote. Only about 50% of Americans turn out for national elections, and the number is even lower for local elections. For midterm elections and local elections. I should say 50% turnout for presidential elections, the big party, right? As we did with Obama. We showed up, and 4 years later, we showed up again. And in the middle, we just kind of said, okay, well, we did the thing, and now the things are going to get better, right? We didn't effectively keep him held accountable because a lot of us were too hung up on identity. It was uncomfortable to critique him in public. There were Black people who felt like you could not do it and talk about him in public. There were people that came into public spaces with critiques that were personal and didn't necessarily belong in public space, like Cornel West, who's delivered some incredibly important and scathing critiques of the president, but began his years-long engagement with President Obama's work with complaining that he didn't get good tickets for the inaugural festivities when Obama first won. Who are you going to be in that ballot box? Who are you showing up for? Who's showing up for you? I don't have the answer to all those questions. I'm reckoning with a lot of that myself. But I do know that no matter how I may feel, no matter how certain I am that the Democratic Party does not deserve my undying loyalty and service and labor, that they have put forward an agenda for Black America on this ticket that certainly best anything that the Trump administration has offered, will offer to our people. I would not trust a check for $1 million from Donald Trump if it landed in my mailbox with my name on it. I certainly would not believe that he has a platinum plan for Black America. And with that, I'm certainly not telling you how to vote or to whom you should be voting for, but I'm acknowledging that when it comes to voting and our identities, stuff is super complicated. We deserve so much more than to be choosing between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. It would be funny if it weren't so sad that these two men are in this race and that we are left to choose between them, and that the debate over which of them we should choose will lead to dissent and conflict between us. But we also have to recognize the difference between being mobilized to act against our own interests, being given a very small seat at the table to advocate in our best interests, and being ignored altogether. What is your identity outside of the booth? It's the same one that you have when you go in there, the virtual booth, because hopefully most of you all are going to be able to vote by mail this year. Who are you showing up for and why? So with that, I want to talk to you all. I see Anaya said, I think a big reason why Biden is on the ballot is our lack of understanding of politics and our political system, and people wanting to believe that we don't need radical change. I certainly think that's a part of it. And as somebody who, I was a Warren surrogate. That was my candidate. I was very enthusiastic about her plans. I had followed her work for many years prior to her becoming a senator. I thought that, I would have wanted her to run in 2016, but certainly she was not going to get over the mountain that is the Clinton family and their role in the DNC. I think a role that has been relied upon to a fault on the part of the party, that they have continued to invest in these people when they should have been thanked for their service and allowed to kind of quietly fade into the background, as pundits and commentators, but not as, anchors of the party in so many ways. But, I chose Senator Warren knowing that Senator Harris was in the race. I did not feel that my identity as a Black woman and the ways in which I relate to her and the things that I have in common with her necessarily made her a better choice for the highest office in the land. And it was hard to not just privately, but publicly reckon with supporting an older white woman when there was a Black woman right there. But I felt like it was the right thing to do. And I see that many pieces of Warren's plan have been adopted by the Biden ticket, which is now the Biden-Harris ticket. And I think that's great. I think it's great that Biden was willing to work with some of his former competitors that were to his left to update his platform and present things to the nation that more, that better reflect my values than what Biden on his own had come up with. But I also think that there was a fearfulness, right? Like there are people who don't believe we need radical change, and there are people who will acknowledge that we do, but they either don't believe that anyone else is going to be down for it, not anyone else literally, but that the majority of Americans are not looking for radical change. That's something that we hear often. It's been central to Biden's success. He said the majority of you all don't want radical change. You just want things to be good and nice, right? That's part of the reason that he's such a mediocre candidate. And there's also, I think, there's a difference between, I don't think we can get somebody radical enough, so I'm not going to push for somebody more radical, and just the fear of what happens if this person is reelected again, and maybe this guy, because he is the most famous, and we are a culture that worships and idolizes celebrity, that Joe Biden, this familiar face, if we can return him to the White House, if we can put him on the ticket, maybe we have a better chance. Okay, Tyler says, with capitalism playing such a huge part, in the selection of candidates, how can we truly get candidates to speak for the people? It's going to be incredibly important. And that's part of the reason why I think the idea, listen, if there was an argument that I personally am not willing, I'll just say this, I'm not willing to sacrifice. I am college educated, middle class, I would say, and again, there's a way we use that word colloquially. I'm in the colloquial definition of middle class, and maybe technically the other one too, but I own no property. I inherited nothing. I send money home to my family. I'm a first generation college graduate. I don't have any real estate. So it's like, I'm not a person of means in that way, but I am more comfortable than the average American in that I've been able to work consistently during COVID, and I can work from home, right? I lost my train of thought for a second there. I know I was talking about how we get candidates to truly speak for the people. Okay, so damn, I'm so sorry. That was going to a very specific place and I lost it, but I will say that one of the most important thing, okay, yes. So if there was some plan that had been proposed by a group of activists and organizers who said, the best thing that we can do in the service of the revolution and in the service of transformative change in this nation would be to not vote for the Democratic candidate if they don't meet our needs, and to instead, back a third party candidate, which would, of course, there's a 0% chance that this person wins an election because we have not done the work of getting enough people across the nation on board to say, I'm going to vote for a third party candidate. But if you're saying, okay, we rather cast this moral vote, right, this symbolic vote for somebody else, or we're going to not vote at all, we're going to protest this. And here's the plan. Here's what comes next of that. And that coming next did not involve the potential for mass deaths. If that did not involve allowing President Trump to continue to install judges from the highest court in the land to the lower courts, many of whom will be in lifetime appointments. If the plan was somehow involved tearing that down, things would be different. But the idea that now was the time to say, we're divesting from the two-party system, we can no longer be forced to choose between the lesser of two evils, or even, to be frank, if we consider the sexual abuse allegations against Joe Biden, right? That he was accused of physically violating a woman, and I don't want to repeat the allegation, but it was a damning accusation, but it was also one that still, unfortunately, stacked against the weight of what a Trump presidency means for us. Not one that, for me, could keep me from casting that vote in my own behalf, on behalf of people who are far less comfortable than I am, who would not be able to get access to health care, to medical care if they had COVID. And I'm very clear that if I, a Black woman, show up in the ER and there's a bunch of people and the doctors are stressed out and I have COVID, my chances are not very good either. So I'm not saying this as if I feel safe or protected or comfortable in any real way. But with that, part of the reason it's important, I think, to install, to vote for the ticket that can be pushed is because we need to start working towards some of these long-term, we don't need to start. This work has been going on for centuries, but we have to, or decades rather, but we have to continue the long-term work that's been taking place in our communities during these large moments where people are talking about civil rights and the years between 1975 and 2014, in which they were not in the forefront of conversation in the same way. But the only way you get to a point where you have candidates that can really speak for the people is that you have to have campaign finance reform, which was central to the Warren platform, I'm just saying, and something that Biden is going to have to continue to be pushed on. But it's important that it's not a matter of if you're the richest person in the room, you can win the race. Trump is a man of means. He is a grifter. He don't have as much money as he says he does, but he's got a lot of resources and he's able to get a lot of people to tap into their pockets and support his agenda, because his agenda is their agenda. It's putting more conservatives on the Supreme Court. It's increasing policing. It's destroying this whole BLM thing and getting these Negroes off the street, right? They're going to show up and they're going to vote for that. They're going to pay for that. They're going to put money into making sure that people in rural America hear that messaging. They're putting a lot of money into making sure that people's aunties and cousins on Facebook that are sharing that misinformation have access to it. We have to change the laws that allow wealthy donors. We have to change the laws that allow, I'm sorry, I've blanked out on the phrase, the word that I was trying to think of, but the super PACs and the lobbyists who are allowed to have almost unchecked influence over our political process. They have to be taken out of the equation, but that only comes with reform. So if we are not willing to swallow our distaste for Joe Biden or Kamala Harris and elect what has to be one in a series of Democratic presidents, right? Because what's happened is that we've not had, we haven't had a tag team of, 8 years of this Democratic president, 8 years of this Democratic president, 8 years of this Democratic president, right? We keep going back and forth. So these administrations don't have the opportunity to get things done. And the next administration comes in and their work, and it goes for both parties, the work of, the Democratic president coming in after the Republican president is the same as the Republican president after the Democratic president, which is to undo everything that the last guy did. So for us to get to a point where we can say we've got a valid, a legitimate third party candidate who can win. We've got a third party that has got the strength in numbers and engagement to present a challenge to the Democrats and the Republicans. You have to first make it so that we can even get people to the ballot, to the polls in the first place, right? We're not going to have candidates that really speak for the people if we're not able to actually have our vote counted. So we're going to have to make a lot of concessions. We're going to have to vote for people that are not left enough, that are not strong enough, that come with complicated histories. And we're also going to have to fight like hell before we get to the presidential election to make sure that somebody like Joe Biden doesn't slide in again. If God forbid we have to do this again in 4 years and start with a new Democrat slate of contenders, that it isn't somebody who's just barely left enough to be considered progress from the guy in office, but it has to be somebody who really represents our interests. Barely to the left of the guy in office as it relates to serving the needs of capitalism, because of course, with Biden being known as one of Wall Street's favorite Democrats. I mean, not that he's barely to the left of Trump in other ways. Hi.
That was definitely an insightful answer. All of them. I especially appreciated your points around just generally, I appreciated your honesty around what the history has been. I definitely learned a lot. So I appreciate that. With that being said, it is 7:12. So I'm going to thank you for coming and being so insightful. And we're going to wrap this up. Again, you were really insightful. I appreciate the passion kind of showed through. I definitely appreciated it. But everybody, have a nice day. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Jamilah.
Thank you for having me.